course, to River and Susanna for the invitation and to invite me here. And I'm really happy to be here to see some familiar faces, friends, and hopefully new ones, really. And and also turning up on a Saturday. Thank you very much, really. And what I hear is that the last two sessions have been fantastic. In fact, I did attend a bit of Danai's lecture day before yesterday. I found it fascinating. I couldn't be there for the whole thing. I really wanted to be there for the whole thing, but there was a conflicting workshop happening at LMC. So I'm really happy to be here. I think, before we start, and you can also advise. So before we start, I think, a couple of things I do want to sort of share, right? And I think it's important that, we talk about it right at the outset because it's important. One is the fact that, we are essentially standing at a university space with a lovely classroom and infrastructure and everything, but we know that there are absolutely no university spaces left all in Gaza. Everything has been destroyed. So that's a context that we must acknowledge and confront. We must also acknowledge that for the last 1 month, starvation in Gaza has been taken to a completely new level. There's hardly been any aid and food entering Gaza, so people literally are dying. So while the conversations in this room are important and meaningful, we must be able to sort of put our conversations today in the larger context of what is happening, right? And I don't want us to lose sight of Palestine. And we will discuss Palestine in relationship to empire, of course, but also specifically in relationship to money and finance. Okay, money, finance, and imperialism. Big words. There's a lot to cover. When Susanna and Nivek told me this is going to be a masterclass, I was a bit uncomfortable with that whole idea. I generally as such, and I really don't think myself to be an expert in any of these things. I know that some of you work on areas of finance and money, so I'm really hoping this is going to be a discussion I get to learn, and hopefully you get to learn a bit. And the idea really is that money and finance have sort of become extremely important topic across the world, right? So you have headlines talking about how do you finance the climate change. You've heard, I'm sure you heard Hamza yesterday. I don't think anybody else can speak better on that front than him, so I'm not going to get into that. So, but you also hear about the sovereign debt crisis, the looming debt crisis in the global south, right? There is more money that goes out in interest payments that the global south pays than the amount of bilateral funding that actually they get. Right? So that's the nature of the crisis on debt. There have been so many different kinds of theoretical responses to this. There is modern monetary theory, for instance. We can talk about that. There is degrowth, which is a thing now. There is talk about the loss and damage fund, for instance. Essentially, what I'm trying to get at is that people are asking the question, where is the money going to come from? Right? And I think that's not the most important question, because for me, and as we will get along, we will see that in many ways the money exists, right? It's about how and where that distribution of resources really happens. Okay? Now, what I want to do is take you through some of the discussions within Marxist thought on the question of money, the question of where money comes from, what it does, and what it is. Okay. Now, I can't claim to cover the whole ground, that's not possible. So what I will do along with you is perhaps share a few snippets of how the trajectory has been on the question of money within Marxist thought. And then we'll try and see how that might help us think about the present with a little more clarity. Right? So why Marx? Right? I think it's important to sort of think about this. Why do we adopt a Marxist framework? We do that for multiple reasons. This is not my.
You want me to pass your slides for you? I can sit here.
No, it's okay. I'll do it. No, please don't worry. Thank you. I thought that my laptop was connected. Anyways. Okay, so why Marx? I think it's an important question. And there are several reasons why we might want to think about Marx, but for me, there are essentially two sets of reasons. One is the fact that when we think about crisis, and we live in a world of crisis, I was at a workshop at LSE on public crisis, although I don't agree with that term as such, but nonetheless, we are in an era of overlapping crisis. For many, it's a new crisis. For many, it's a manifestation of centuries-long processes of extraction and exploitation. And I think there is no better thinker than Marx himself who can tell us more about crisis as such, right? And how crisis is an inherent feature of capitalist production. We'll get into that question. So that's one reason. I think Marx really offers that framework to understand crisis as a totality, as a unified form. Second, I think, the reason why Marx becomes important to consider is because Marx himself thought that his contribution on money is one of the most significant contributions that he made, right? Especially as against classical economists like Ricardo. So there is quite a bit that Marx deals with on the question of money, because money is, in fact, the motor of capitalist expansion and development. Right? So this is a really nice quote that might get us started off, and we will go through a lot of quotes, right? And some of these quotes are slightly difficult to read, but I want us to read it together. We'll try and dissect what it means. So he says, now, however, we have to perform a task never even attempted by bourgeois economists. He's essentially referring to Ricardo. That is, we have to show the origins of this money form. And we try and unpack what the money form is. Why is Marx? Marx is always obsessed with forms. Right? That is, we have to show the origins of this money form. We have to trace the development of the expression of value contained in the value relation of commodities from its simplest, almost imperceptible outline to the dazzling money form. When this has been done, the mystery of money will immediately disappear. This is dramatic, really. There is mystery in it, there is the dazzling nature of money in it, but there's also simplicity. So essentially what he's telling us. Right, so I mean, this quote really tells us that money was important to Marx. And he spent quite a bit of time thinking about the origins of money, but also the money form, what it does, what it is, and how it plays a crucial role in the process of capitalist accumulation. Right, and I think, so what I'm also going to do throughout this talk is sort of give you signposts about literature on the topic, so that you can go back and read some of this stuff if you're already reading. This is a really wonderful quote, I think, from Susanna de Bono. Now, she really brought Marx on money back into discussion and academic in an academic setting. I mean, Marx was important to money for a long time. Marxists themselves really forgot about that aspect until, of course, Rosa Luxemburg came in and Hilferding came in and a few others that we will discuss. Then again, the topic really became slightly less discussed. But in 1970s, she came out with this book, which is now again being reprinted in 2015 by Burst Books. I would really recommend if you can get it. And she says that a couple of things. That the Marxist theory of money interests us primarily because of its integration with the theory of capitalist form of production. According to Marx, money is a social relation of production. It's not a thing that exists, something out there, ahistorical. No, it's a relationship. Okay. And therefore, under capitalism, it is part of that capitalist system of relations of production. So it's integral to that relationship of production. But, and this is important, it participates in them in its special fashion. Right? There's something different about money than other commodities. It's special. By existing in the form of money, again, form, we are going to be coming back to this idea of form. Why are we so obsessed with form? What does it tell us? By existing in the form of money. And the monetary problem consists precisely in knowing the meaning of this strange existence as money, inseparable but distinct from the other relations characteristic of capitalism. So essentially, just like Marx, he also suggests that money has something in it which distinguishes itself from other such similar things within capitalist production and distribution. What is it? Okay, before we get into this, I do want us to remember that, we ought not to be sort of trying to find out the true meaning of what Marx said. I think that's an exercise which really does not get us anywhere. So we are not trying to essentialize things in any sense, right? And instead, what would be more productive is to look at how Marxist theorists have taken on some of the analytical perspectives and theoretical moves within Marx to then reflect upon other things, right? I mean, the question of what Marx really meant is not really a question that neither of us can really answer. Second, we must also acknowledge that while Marx did, in fact, spend considerable time and effort thinking about money, he did not do so with respect to debt and the credit system, right? He didn't live that long. And we know that Marx was a serial procrastinator, right? And that gives us some
other things.
Exactly. So he wanted to write quite a bit on debt, and he wanted to write quite a bit on state. And these things are very important when we think about money, which he really did not live up to be doing. Which is why Bernhoff says that when it comes to the credit system, what Marx writes is more a stimuli for thought rather than a cohesive theory. So while we go back to Marx not to really understand him, but the way he approaches relationships and social relationships around us, money being one of them. Right. So I'll give you three perspectives. I'll give you three perspectives on money, finance, and imperialism from a Marxist lens. First is about the origins of money. Now,
There's a weird thing that comes sometimes.
yeah, that's okay. I think we can see. Yeah. So what does Marx say about the origins of money? I mean, it's quite explicit, but I do want us to have a little bit of discussion about what this really means. Let's look at the quote. Quotes are important. Okay. He says, because all commodities as values are objectified human labor, so human labor, and therefore in themselves commensurable, their values can be communally measured in one and the same specific commodity. And this commodity can be converted into the common measure of their values, that is, into money. Not very easy to understand, but there is a thinking behind this. Money as a measure of value is the necessary form of appearance of the measure of value which is immanent in commodities, namely labor value. What do you think this quote means? What is he saying? There are a few hints here already. What is he saying? Where does he locate the origins of money as such? Because this is central to his conception of money, and we'll see how this is very different from some of the recent aggregations like monetary theory and other things. What is he saying here? There are a few key things here. There is a question of value. There's a question of human labor. There is a question of commensurability. Yeah, come on. Yeah.
I mean, because there is like three functions of money. So measure of value, means of circulation, and also money is such. So measure money as measure of value is like the first function of money, and how Marx is trying to find how value can become actual, because the value as such is a social form, so it is not like a sensible thing.
Yeah.
So money functions as this medium through which and commodities can actually be exchanged. So it's like an instance of social sanction. Yeah.
Right, absolutely, yes, correct. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
That it's somehow like a representation of labour time. So it's something that it's a capacity that we have to do something.
Yeah.
And then that representation is modulated or maybe mediated through two things, which is that it's social.
Yeah.
So it somehow represents everybody's capacity. So the abstraction is based on the fact that it represents a kind of something that everyone can do.
Correct.
And that isn't necessary for some reason.
Right.
That represents it like that.
Absolutely, correct. Yeah. So there are two things that come out of this. One is the question of exchange, right? And just to rephrase what you said, the question of socially necessary labor time. That's how Marx used it. Socially necessary labor time that is required to produce commodities. Anything else? And we'll see how these two things come together. Anything else? Okay, so I mean, you're broadly correct. Huh? I mean, what essentially, I mean, the scheme is like this. We have commodities across everywhere, right? And commodities and themes for that matter, commodities have a use value and an exchange value. Right? So I use this bottle to drink water, but this bottle also can be exchanged for something else, right? So use value and exchange value. Now, if all commodities have an exchange value, then, as your colleague rightly pointed out, they can be exchanged, right? Now, the question is, how do you exchange two commodities which are not the same? Right? The way to do it is through abstraction. And the way you abstract is you say, well, this commodity is similar to this commodity by the very fact that there is an abstract amount of labor that is being used to produce it, which is, and you can compute that by looking at the socially necessary labor time that is used to produce these two commodities. So what makes these two commodities, which are not commensurate to each other, commensurable to each other or identical to each other, is the fact that both have been produced through labor necessary, through socially labor necessary time, right? Now the question is, no problem. Now the question is, how do you determine, how do you measure socially necessary labor time that has gone into this and gone into this so that it can be exchanged? For that, you need a medium. That's where money comes in. Money is a measure of the amount of labor that has gone into producing things, which is why Marx calls it a universal equivalent, right? To which two commodities which are not the same can nonetheless be commensurable and be exchanged. That's why, for Marx, money emerges from commodities, which is why it is called the commodity theory of money. And for Marx, money emerges when trade transpires between communities and peoples. Right? So money is needed to represent the abstract labor in commodities. Right. Now, what is different in Marxist theory from that of, let's say, modern monetary theory? And I put modern monetary theory in this because, we talk a lot about modern monetary theory, and I want to talk about that as well. Because modern monetary theory suggests otherwise, that money does not come from commodities or does not emerge from commodities, but it is essentially state sanctioned. Marxist theory is different. Okay. Now, the value of money, right? Because money, even though it is a medium of exchange, it is also a commodity in itself. Right? So during Marxist time, it was the gold standard, which was prevalent across the Western world, right? Where all currencies were essentially pegged to a certain amount of gold, right? And had to be backed by gold. So gold essentially represented an amount or a certain specific amount of money in itself. So money in itself was also a commodity. Right? Now, what is interesting is that from a Marxist perspective, the value that money holds cannot be arbitrarily set. It cannot be just any value that money has. But the value that money possesses is the totality of all the goods and commodities that are produced in a particular community. It represents, so the amount of money that is there in the economy, for instance, is nothing but the sum of all the commodities that are produced and are circulated. That's the value of money. So it's not an arbitrary thing that one can decide, right? Now, it's still on very technical, theoretical stuff, but I promise this is the most technical part of the whole thing, and then things become less technical. Are you all with me on this? Yeah? Okay, good. So that's where money comes from. Now, you might not agree with this, and MMTs don't agree with this, but that's up for discussion that we can discuss later. Which is why they say that that Marxist conception of money is an endogenous conception of money. So money does not arise from somewhere else. Money emerges from within societies themselves. Right? Okay. On the question of public debt, as I said, Marx did not say much, right? Excepting for observing that even during his time, that there was some kind of a concentration and centralization of production that was happening through the rise of giant corporations. And as corporations came to acquire more and more space within societies, a system of credit started emerging, right? But there was no systematic theory behind this concept of debt and credit. That's all his observation was, right? This was taken up by Rosa Luxemburg in the accumulation of capital, in some sense. And there's a lot to unpack in that book. But what I want to do is simply look at this particular quote, because for us, what is important is to look at not just public debt as a thing, but public debt in terms of how it relates to the question of capitalism and empire. They go hand in hand. And Rosa Luxemburg essentially writes that loans, which are debt, are indispensable for the emancipation of rising capitalist states. True. They are yet the surest ties by which the old capitalist states maintain their influence, exercise financial control, and exert pressure on the customs, foreign, and commercial policy of young capitalist states. Right? So for Luxemburg, public debt was a means through which the old world, the new world, was sought to be integrated into the capitalist system. Right? But this integration was to happen through a coercive means, by which they would be tied to the former capitalist powers. Right? And notice the difference. I mean, she doesn't talk about colonial powers or colonies, right? She talks about capitalist states, new capitalist states, and old capitalist states. Right? So that's the frame that she operates within. Colony colonizer is a frame, but she understands this relationship from the perspective of capitalist expansion. And for that, debt became a central means. Right, and this has been taken up by several authors. You've heard of primitive accumulation in the last two lectures. For Rosa Luxemburg, one of the ways in which primitive accumulation can be seen in the present, because her argument was that primitive accumulation is not simply something that happens at the original stage of capitalist expansion, but happens throughout, is through debt. And this has been taken up by Harvey and the others, right? Do any of you know what this is? Santosh, but Santosh,
The debt that was France had put on Haiti after the slave revolt.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. Yeah, can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Okay, so there was obviously a slave revolt in Haiti and kind of independence in a sense, and then when France went back in there and basically signed a treaty that meant that Haiti had to pay back, I can't remember the amount, but a huge amount of money, essentially because of loss in property being slavery or slaves.
Yeah, exactly. That's true. So when Haiti, right, got its independence, one of the conditions that were imposed by France was that you have to give us reparations. I mean, we think about reparations today, right? But you have to give us reparations for the slaves that we lost because of your independence. You have to pay us back. And slaves were property, like the colleague said. So there was a huge amount that that Haiti had to pay at the dawn of its own independence. I can't remember the exact figures. It was about 150 million francs or something like that. That's interesting from the perspective of Rosa Luxemburg. But what is even more interesting is this. Where do you think Haiti got that money from?
They borrowed it from France.
Exactly. They borrowed it from France and they borrowed it from French banks. So this is basically a note from one of the French banks which says 30,000 francs has been borrowed. So you see the cycle that in the way it operates, right? You are supposed to be in debt and you pay that debt to the same systems and from the same institutions in the former capitalist states, right? Okay. Now, in the world of Marxist intellectuals, after Rosa Luxemburg, Hilferding acquires an extremely prominent place when it comes to finance. He does that not only because of the book that he writes in 1910 called Finance Capital, but also because he gets the unwavering support from Lenin, right? And we'll see how that happens. And essentially, what he says can be summed up in this quote, right? He says that the most characteristic feature of modern capitalism, he's writing in 1910, of modern capitalism, are those processes of concentration which, on the one hand, eliminate free competition through the formation of cartels and trust, and on the other, bring bank and industrial capital into an ever more intimate relationship. Right? Through this relationship, capital assumes the form of finance capital, its supreme and most abstract expression. Right? So essentially what he was saying is that in this era of imperialism, there was a fusion of industrial capital and finance capital, right? Or banking capital at that point in time. Together, they formed these large integrated monopolies, which is why monopoly capitalism, right? And monopoly capitalism essentially integrated both industrial capital and bank capital. And in this era, he observed that banks not only were giving credit to companies, but they were also controlling them by acquiring shares and debt within those companies. So banks basically became, in some sense, the heart of the finance economy. Right? What is interesting is this, the last point, that Hilferding drew a structural relationship between this growing finance monopoly capitalism and the role of the state. Now remember, the role of the state was much less theorized in Marx's writings. Hilferding extended that analysis to think about what does the, so fine, we have these huge banks that are now controlling industry. There is a fusion of industrial capital and banking capital. What does the state do at that point in time? So he thought about that question. What do you think the state did at that point in time? What would be the role of the state?
Enforce repayment of debt.
Yeah, so enforced repayment of debt, so definitely enforcement of contracts and so on and so forth. What else?
Definitely the state needs to make the money, like, so
Sorry?
even though like the state
Yes.
is the monopoly of like the money, so it needs to emit money back then as well. Like even though you have the banks, really,
Yeah.
it's like the function of the state is also to control how many money you're like you have in the country.
That's true. That's also one of the functions, yes. But think slightly beyond borders. Think a bit more in terms of world economy.
Yeah, then state will have capital to move, circulate across borders by either coercion or either coercion or
Yeah, exactly. So for Hilferding, among these two reasons, he found that for this integrated whole of industrial and banking capital to remain stable, right? The state needs to play a key role in acquiring resources. The state needs to play a key role in acquiring new spaces of production. And this new spaces of production, therefore, had to happen outside of borders, had to happen in the colonies. Right? So the state would acquire a tremendous role in terms of facilitating imperialism beyond the state. And this was an extremely important point for Bukharin, right? And he comes after Hilferding. And he extends Hilferding's analysis to the world economy, because Hilferding was still talking within the national sphere, but he extends it beyond. And he says, world finance capitalism and the internationally organized domination of banks are one of the most undeniable facts of economic reality, right? And he says that monopoly capital was getting more and more intertwined with the state. Why? The first point is important. What does he say? Why was it important for the state? I mean, we discussed the second point, the colonial control and expropriation of raw materials. The first point is also very important. Why do you think monopoly capitalism or monopoly capital had to rely on the state? Yeah.
When you think about the credit system is like advancing capital that is not yet realized.
Correct.
So we need like expansion of capitalism and only like an authority like the central power of the state with its binding force could like expand the territory and also capitalist world economy. So, it's like and that's a necessity of this whole credit system.
Yeah, that's true. That's one. What else? Like, do you have a hand up here?
It's very against that, but like I guess in the credit system kind of almost begins with the idea of like a national debt and the idea that you kind of sponsor the state that you're a part of to prosecute kind of foreign like insurgencies or whatever. So if you need this expansion of your kind of market space or your production space, which you're wanting the state to do, then a part of that is building the idea that there is like a national debt where certain parts of your civil society essentially like sponsor the futurity of the state and lend it money in order to prosecute these kinds of foreign ventures that would then open up the market that it needs to reproduce itself.
Yeah. So opening of the market is a point that we can start off with. That's a good starting point. But the question is that at that point in time, because no, let's not forget that all of them, Hilferding, from Rosa Luxemburg, Hilferding, Bukharin, then Lenin, all of them were talking. Sorry, all of them were talking about a stage of imperialism, right? Imperialism as a stage within capitalism, right? And all of them, along with the fact that they were concerned with exploitation and expropriation in the colonies, they were also observing the fact that for monopoly capitalism to survive, to be stable, right, the state also needs to be able to fend off competition from others. Because at the time of high imperialism, it was not just France and Germany and England, but all of these imperial powers were essentially doing the same thing. So how do you safeguard French capital as opposed to British capital in Africa? You need a strong centralization within the state. The state needs to play a role, right? So that's why he says that, well, we cannot think about monopoly, in his terms, monopoly capitalism and the world economy without the role that the state plays in mediating between the national and the world, right? Do you have a question? No, you had a question.
I lost me.
Okay. Okay, so that's him. Lenin then comes in, right? And this is the book which becomes very popular. And essentially, he agrees with Hilferding. More or less, it's a repetition of his analysis when it comes to finance capital. He says, well, there is a concentration of production, just like how Hilferding mentioned. There's also a merging of banks with industry, Hilferding thesis. And for him, that's how he defined imperialism. He said imperialism is capitalism at that stage of development at which the dominance of monopolies and finance capital is established, in which the export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, imperialism, in which the division of the world among the international trusts has begun. There was a division of the world in terms of who controls finance in which parts of the world, for which the state becomes important, in which division of all territories of the globe among the biggest capitalist powers has been completed. Before that, Hilferding precisely talks about this, that there is a competition among the leading spheres of capital. And he says imperialism is that stage where this process of competition, this process of carving out spaces of capitalist expansion within the colonies has been completed, right? So he basically agrees with Hilferding, and this really provides a much larger platform to Hilferding than he had before. If you read Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Lenin, you will also see that he takes occasional, not occasional, quite substantive jibes at Kautsky and his idea of imperialism. They did not agree for a long time. He also, not in this book, but in other writings, he also criticizes Rosa Luxemburg. In fact, he even accuses Rosa Luxemburg of distorting Marx in a big way. None of them were actually happy with Rosa's thesis at that point in time. And we can get into the question of why, because, well, Rosa was an underconsumptionist. The others were more about overproduction, and there's a difference between that. We'll get into it. So this is basically your 1917, the predictions that were made by some of these central figures. Now, what we know is that not all of these predictions turned out to be true. Right. So what we found is that instead of banks and industry coming together, we saw a increasing distance among them. And we also saw that what really was the driver of capital was not really banks, but it was financial markets. So financialization came up in a big way, right? But the idea is not to sort of dismiss them too quickly, because what their framework suggests, and that's important, the frameworks and the analytical tools, is that financialization and public debt has to be looked at from the larger perspective of imperialism, subordination, and dependency in the colonies, right? Okay, now financialization. So we come to this third aspect of Marxist contribution. And here two people become important, Sweezy and Madoff, and they essentially argued that monopoly capitalism, so equally, Lenin and the others, monopoly capitalism has this inherent tendency to go into stagnation for a number of reasons, right? Overproduction could be one reason. There are just way too many commodities that people are not able to buy. There could be, and for them, the problem was essentially that there was too much capital going around, so it could not be absorbed or within the economy. So at some point, there would be a stagnation in the economy, and we have seen that. We have seen that in the 1970s. We have seen that. We have seen that also during the 1990s. And he says that whenever there is a stagnation in monopoly capitalism, right, that is sort of being fixed, or that is sought to be fixed through financialization. Right. So they argue that the fix to stagnation came out to be more credit, more loans, more speculation. Yep. And of course, they argued that this process of financialization, which was to actually sort of try and solve the crisis of monopoly capitalism, reinforces questions of class and wealth. That we'll come back to in a bit. So that was their thesis, right? And this is not very difficult to imagine. So some of the crises that we've seen in the last decades, right, have been crises of credit. So 2008 financial crisis was a debt crisis in some sense, public debt. Right? Speculation played a big role in that crisis, especially with the asset-backed securities market. Yeah, and I know that some of you are working on finance, so we can have a discussion on that as well. So that was the idea, that monopoly capitalism, as the Marxist funda goes, capitalism brings with itself its own set of crises. It reaches that crisis of stagnation. What do? You devise a new mechanism that is financialization, which involves speculation, shares, debt, and so on and so forth. Right? Okay. Now, this is important and interesting. Looks technical, but it is not. I promise. Because fictitious capital and fetishization go hand in hand with financialization. Okay. Marx did not talk so much about financialization, but he did talk about fictitious capital and fetishization. And Sweezy and Madoff essentially built off from Marx's observation that there is a tendency of capital to move from MCM to MM. What does this mean? I'm sure you know this, and once I tell you, it will become as clear as if you always knew it. Go on.
I think it just means that when we think about like asset values appreciating, there's no commodity intermediating the profits from M to N prime.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely. Anything else anybody wants to add? Yeah.
You're going away from the productive process, entering only the speculative
Yes.
sense.
Yeah.
Making money off of money.
Exactly, yeah, great, yeah.
And just add, it's interesting to then think about like what happens to the category of use value.
Mhm.
It looks like we just end up with like pure exchange values,
Absolutely.
but then there is still a use value.
Absolutely,
I think it's very interesting to ask what role law plays
Yeah.
in producing what that use value is.
Yeah, we're getting that, yeah, for sure, yeah, absolutely. All the 3 points are great. You have.
Yeah, and actually, if you complement what you said about like the use value dimension, is like the concrete, like material dimension,
Yeah.
like the trigger of
Yeah.
the support of
Yeah.
this economic relation.
Yeah.
So like it shows capital, like it's purely social existence
Yeah.
of capital in this sense. And also we think about how it is not based on like labor and production.
Yeah.
Production process, but like it is produced out of circulation.
Mhm.
That's the fiction.
Yeah. Yeah, it's perfect. I mean, yeah. So Marx's MCM formula is a very famous formula, right? And basically encapsulates capitalism in a way, right? And if you see, there is M here and there's an M dash there, right? There's a difference between the first M and the second. The first M is basically the money that you put in to buy or sell a commodity, seize commodity. And under capitalism, you would only sell or buy to get a profit out of it, right? So if you're a good capitalist, your M, which is the money that you started off with to buy yourself a commodity, to get money, M dash, ought to be more if you're a good capitalist. So this is the surplus value basically, which is ideally more than the first one. So M dash minus M will give you your surplus value, right? That's the way capitalism works, if you're a good capitalist. What Marx said is that, well, there is this increasing tendency that somehow capitalism seeks to remove commodities altogether from that equation, right? Where you enter into transaction which money as a commodity in itself makes money out of money, just like what your colleague said, right? And this he calls the interest-bearing capital, right? And the form, again, in the form of interest-bearing capital, where capital appears immediately unmediated by the production and circulation process. So, like your colleague said, there is no production process in between anymore. Capital appears as a mysterious and self-creating source of interest. Money begets money, right? The thing that is money, commodity, value is now already capital simply as a thing, right? Now, this he says, this form of M is perhaps when the relationship of money reaches its most superficial and fetishized form, right? And that's fictitious capital, right? Because it does not exist because it does not and is not backed by any form of physical commodity. It exists on paper. So this is basically how Marxists have sort of drawn how financialization works through Marx's iteration of MCM and MM. So next time you see MCM and MM, you know what that is. Okay, now how much have I spoken for? I've spoken for too long already. No? Okay. Okay, good. All right. Okay, now so this is, I think, you know, Marxism and finance and debt and capital, I know 0001. Okay, because it's very basic, absolutely basic. I mean, I can't do more than this anyways. I don't know much. What we'll do now is see how some of these discussions have come into play when we talk about third world Marxists. What did they do with these observations? That's interesting, right? And I'm sure you discussed some of these figures also in the previous lectures, but you might have read otherwise. So first thing that they were really concerned with is how money and capital reproduces relationships of race and racialization in the colonies, right? And the way they argued it, and we'll see how it was fleshed out, and the way they argued it is that if capitalism is all about abstractions, right? And if capitalism needs to work through abstractions, just the way, we saw that money is an abstraction, labor form is an abstraction, then under capitalism, abstractions take multiple forms: race, gender, class, right? And money also then becomes one of these abstractions through which capital operates, right? And what the third world Marxists started arguing is that there is an intimate relationship between how race sort of constitutes and co-constitutes the way money creates hierarchies, and how money sort of reinforces racial hierarchy. Right, so essentially two questions they were trying to answer. How does money's abstract form mobilize and reproduce racial othering and colonial hierarchies? And conversely, how does the abstract form of race and gender go on to constitute money's empire? These were the two questions they were concerned with, right? These two figures are key in this question. I'm sure you know both of them. Samir Amin, of course, Egyptian economist, and really a key voice in third world Marxist debates, especially on questions of money and finance. And Joseph Boehme. Now, he was a Cameroonian economist, and his life was really interesting. I mean, he was an IMF staff member, worked for the IMF, but he left in protest because, he didn't agree with what they were doing. And then he wrote this fantastic book, Money, Serfdom, and Freedom, right? And obviously we can't get into all of what they say, but essentially what they were arguing is that money has become a tool through which value is constantly being transferred from the periphery to the core. Money becomes the central instrument through which it happens, and we will see how. And it happens without any question. It happens as if it was inevitable, because race makes this relationship normal and inevitable, right? So this is one example that I have for you. I'm sure, do you know this? What is this? What is this? What is it I'm talking about? Do you have an answer?
Yeah, there was a currency out of, I forgot the name of this.
Yeah.
Franc,
Yeah.
created by the former colonizer France
Yeah.
in that region, true monetary institutions across the region.
Yeah.
The former colonies.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Anybody wants to add to that? So this picture shows 14 West and Central African countries, which were former colonies of France, who still use the CFA franc. Right? And CFA franc was a colonial currency that was created in 1945 by the French government when some of these countries started getting independence. Right? This is the set of relationships even today. So this is not a picture from 1945. This is a picture of how things are today. So these countries still use the CFA franc as their own national currency. What does that mean? That is the question I want to get into. What does it mean if you as, I don't know, Chad, right? You as Chad don't have your own currency, but you use the currency, you use let's say the French currency. What does it mean? What implications does it have?
Value of your currency and your economy is tied to that in France.
Right. So I would say not your currency because you don't really have your own currency, but your economy is tied to France. In what specific ways? That's the Marxist question. Right? Under what specific conditions is this possible, and how does it happen? Think a bit more. I'm sure you know the answers to this. I mean, what happens when you don't have your own currency? Your economy is completely tied, yes, but in what's
You don't have autonomy because you're subordinated to the central bank of the country. So you don't have you can't truly have sovereignty in your country.
Correct, absolutely. So you would not have any monetary policy autonomy in any significant way. Why is monetary policy autonomy important?
At one level, it's like it creates what looks like a racialized relation as a class relation, where you have a set monetary policy that would benefit a certain class in a home in the metropole.
Yeah.
And that then becomes a racialized class relation when it's transposed into how that policy would affect
Yeah.
communities in these parts.
Yeah, can you expand a bit on the class relation?
I don't think I can really, but it's just not well,
Yeah.
I mean, it would probably take like half an hour to work out that.
Okay, but we'll come back to the question. It's a good question. How sort of the class relations here are also a reflection of the race relations here. Okay, so
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. So monetary policy becomes significant for any country because monetary policy helps you determine how much of money is going to circulate into your economy. Right? And that matters because through monetary policy, right, you have a check over demand and supply. You have a check over inflation. In this kind of a setting, all the central banks, all the 14 central banks, right, are completely tied to the monetary policy frameworks of the Bank of France. Now the European Central Bank, because the Bank of France is in the Union, so now the European Central Bank. Right. It also means a far more significant thing. All central banks have what they call reserves. Reserves are essentially foreign currency that you hold as a central bank so that you can use that foreign currency to stabilize your markets if necessary. It's like a rainy day thing. Okay. As a result of this relationship, the CFA franc, the monetary reserves that all of these central banks have, which is nothing but a way of ensuring themselves against uncertainty and instability, all of those monetary reserves are actually kept in the French Treasury. They're not kept in the central banks of these countries. Right? Now, I think, and this is interesting, the central bank of all of these countries, right, have a French member who has a veto on decisions. So this is the set of monetary relations that operate today, not in 1945, not in 1900s, so on and so forth. And Joseph Poeme and Samir Amin both have looked at this relationship in a much more deeper way than I did right now. But they were very, very vocal about the fact that the CFA franc ties the African economies completely to the French. Right? If you want to follow up on this, this is a really good book that came out recently, Africa's Last Colonial Currency. It would give you a very good insight about what's happening. There is now quite a bit of protests that are happening in these countries about doing away with the CFA franc, but that comes with its own set of problems. The IMF is not happy with it. The World Bank is not happy with it. And many of these countries need the IMF and the World Bank to be able to operate. So there's a lot going on that front. I wanted to put this out there. These are some of the recent literature that has come out on the question of how money was one of the most important instruments through which empire was sustained and facilitated. So the book on the left on British imperialism and the making of colonial currency systems talks about the British Empire. And how and what kind of currency relations were put into the colonies. Do any of you have an idea? What did the British do? How do you tie in the colonies through currency? We saw an example with the kind of first. Right. Yeah.
At least in Brazil, what they did
Yeah.
was we are completely dependent of imports from England,
Mhm.
and we didn't have. They kept the colonies from develop their industries, so they're very dependent on importing manufacturers from England, at least in that period of time.
Yeah. You're heavily relying on imports, and if you want to import, then you need.
You need to use their currency because they're just
Sorry.
you need to use like Britain, like in the currency, because they just make transactions in their own currency. But if you have the biggest market and everybody's buying for, it's the same that happening with the US. You have to have US dollar if you want to mix it.
Exactly. That's true. So exactly. So if you are relying on imports, which many of these countries are, how do you pay for imports? You pay for imports through foreign currency. You can't pay for imports through your own currency. You have to pay for imports through most likely US dollars, right? Which is why it is important for central banks to have this reserve of currency so that you can pay for these imports. You can also save it if there is a balance of payments crisis. So in this book, Narsi, what he does is he shows us how British colonial policies, especially monetary policies, were structured in a way that they created what are called currency boards. I don't know if you've ever come across that term, but if you haven't, have a look at it when you have the time. So currency boards are essentially, let's say, central banks without any authority, because they are supposed to mirror exactly what the Bank of England did. Now, obviously, the monetary policy that is most useful for the Bank of England is not going to be most useful for Indian policy, right? They have completely different economies, different needs. One is an importer, one is an exporter. So they instituted currency boards that had to mimic the Bank of England's policies. They also ensured that the reserves that these central banks would have, much like the CFA franc, would be kept in the Bank of England, not in their own countries, right? And this is where, racialization comes into our in front of us very starkly, is that British colonial policies were very different when it came to how they operated within white settler spaces and non-white settler spaces. So in white settler spaces like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, they had minimum restrictions in terms of foreign exchange reserves. You could keep most of your foreign exchange reserves in your own country. But for the larger infrastructure of franchise colonialism, like in India, those reserves were drained back to India. Which is why a lot of economists have suggested that the white settler colonies, because of the monetary policy autonomy and financial autonomy that they had, a little more than the others, their path towards development and prosperity has been higher than other sets of colonies, right? Patnaik is a Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik, they're married to each other and they're a fantastic couple. They have done some fantastic work on this, okay? And the amount of drain to finance and money that has gone from India to the British, right? So these are some bits of literature that you can look at it when you have the time. Okay, now we come to dependency theory. Now, dependency theory is an important strand of Marxist theory, especially when it comes to money and finance. Okay, and this is important also because you're all writing your theses, and many of you are doing Marxist work. So have a look at the strand of dependency theorists, and there are mainly there's a lot in there, but most of the literature that I have read really has talked about these three figures, all from Brazil. And dependency theory essentially, obviously, builds off from the longer lineage of Marxist thought, right? And proposes two core propositions to the debate. First is that when capitalism acquires a global stage or a global capitalism acquires a global phenomena, there is an international division of labor that's happening. Very simple, we have heard this, right? And this is supplemented with tremendous capital mobility. So they were analyzing the 1980s, 1990s, when there was this whole wave of liberalization that happened. Free capital mobility was the norm. The IMF and the World Bank, through structural adjustments, sort of implored countries to open up their capital accounts. And that created a problem, they argued, right? That created a problem of international division of finance. So from international division of labor, they argued we get international division of finance, which essentially means that this system of open capital and the pre-existing set of relationships that came with the international division of labor, where certain countries are meant only for raw materials and for other things, while the core countries are meant for furnished and finished goods. This translated also into a hierarchy of national currencies, right? Where core currencies, and we look at what those core currencies are, United States dollar, euro, and so on and so forth, became reservoirs of high liquidity and safety, whereas currencies of the peripheral nations were considered to be more volatile and less liquid, right? If you want to visualize it, it looks something like this, right? It's a very simple representation, but perhaps the most profound thing that you can take away from this lecture, right? That there is this international hierarchy of currencies where there are some currencies at the top and there are some currencies at the bottom, right? It comes with tremendous implications. So as we move down the pyramid, four things happen. First, you are exposed to more monetary stability. Think Brazil, think India, think Sri Lanka, right? As we go down, you have to acquire more and more foreign exchange reserves to help you get out of that instability. Why is this a problem? Why is accumulation of foreign exchange? It should be a good thing, right? That you're acquiring more and more foreign exchange so that you can use it on occasions of instability.
Is there like not being productive, not going for any clients?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So foreign exchange reserves comes with tremendous costs because the money that you acquire, right? You don't invest it in health, education, anything. You just need to keep it, right? To stabilize your currency. The further you go down the pyramid, you become less liquid as a currency, right? Nobody wants to buy your currency. Nobody wants to sell your currency, which means that you inevitably have to go to international financial institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, mostly the IMF, to help you provide that liquidity. Finally, the more you go down, you are exposed to sovereign debt crisis, right? Why is that the case? Why do you think a country which is somewhere here, let's say India, and a country somewhere here, will have completely different chances of falling into a sovereign debt crisis.
Yes.
Yeah.
I guess if you're lower, you have to get more foreign currency to pay for goods that you're buying.
Mhm.
And may end up having more debt, whereas
That's true.
if you're in the US, you can print, which is maybe where the MMT is money. MMT people come from, say that if you're in one of the higher ones, you can just print.
Yeah. Printing is a point. What else?
You're also dependent on the economic situation of the other countries, like we had many crises in the 80s.
That's true.
So from Latin America.
Yeah.
If there is an interest rate rising in
Yeah.
the US, then
Yeah.
your own debt suffers.
Suffers,
the
yeah.
impact.
Exactly. Yes, that's true. One fundamental reason why you're exposed to a sovereign debt crisis if you're somewhere lower in the pyramid is because you cannot acquire that debt in your own currency. You have to acquire that debt in an international currency which has liquidity. So for instance, when Chad in the other slide wants to borrow money, and it's super important for states to borrow money because that's the way you spend. We tend to think that states spend on education, health, and all of that through taxes. They do, but a significant portion comes from debt, right? Now, if you have to acquire debt, you go to international financial markets because your own markets are small. If you go to international financial markets, you cannot acquire that debt in your own currency because your currency is not liquid. You have to acquire that debt in either euros or US dollars, which means that every instability that the US faces, Europe faces, your debt keeps fluctuating, right? And we'll see instances of that. So they essentially brought out that there are significant ties of dependency and subordination that is baked into the international monetary system through the way currencies are organized in the system. Right. Now, this is okay. We've come now. Now we've come out of the dependency theorists. Right. It was a small snapshot. Should we take a break? Or I don't have too many more slides, or we can just rush and finish and then take a break and up to you.
I think maybe it's nice to take a break and then finish and then talk straight away after you finish, rather than finishing, take a break and then talk.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, let's see. Very good. Works. Also, I just wanted to say thank you to all the online participants. I can't see anybody, but thank you for being there. Okay, really. Yeah. Okay. So now I want to. So we have talked about race. We have talked about empire. We have talked about colonialism. We have talked about money. What I want to do here is sort of give you a flavor of how class relations work with respect to monetary policy. And so for the longest time, not long, from about the 1970s, right, since the fall of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, from about that time, there was a transformation in the way monetary policy was understood. And there was a transformation in the way that central banks, which are key players in monetary management, came to be understood. What was that transformation? The transformation was that central banks, which before the 1970s were considered to be, in Epstein's word, and we come to him, agents of development. So central banks were political instruments. They were mandated to do many different things, not just adjust interest rates like they do now, not just target inflation like they do now, but they were doing a whole host of things. They were looking at unemployment. They were directing money towards critical sectors of the economy. They were engaged in terms of poverty alleviation in many of these, in the countries in the global south. So central banks had a much wider role before the 1970s. And they were political instruments. Now, 1970s marked the start of what is known as monetarism, right? And monetarism essentially transformed the central bank into a technical, neutral, and an apolitical institution. And how did that happen? Monetarists argued that in the 1970s, you would remember that there was this long period of stagflation. Stagflation is essentially the idea that there was increasing inflation alongside increasing unemployment. Right? And it's a very bad mix. More inflation, prices of goods getting higher, but unemployment also increasing. Monetarists argued that the only way to deal with this issue is that we need to make the central bank raise interest rates. Right? And we need to make the central bank target what they called price stability. We need to stabilize money circulating in the economy. There are implications of that. When you increase interest rates, like what Paul Volcker did when he joined the Federal Reserve, which is why sometimes it's also called the Volcker shock. What he did was he continuously went on increasing interest rates of the central banks, which meant that essentially he was sucking money out of the market. Because the more you raise interest rates, the less loans are given out. Because companies don't want to take loans in higher interest rates. The less loans that companies take out, the less they produce. The less they produce, the less they hire people. So as a result of these increasing interest rates, there was this effect on tremendous unemployment, but at the same time, inflation came down. So Volcker and the monetarists around that time declared victory, saying that, see, we have cut down inflation. Right. But they did not sort of recognize the cost that it took. Right. And from that, a general consensus started emerging, saying that the best way to deal with the economy is when a central bank does three things. One is that it targets only price stability, that is the control of inflation. So if you see in the if any of you are working with the European Central Bank, you will see that price stability is the fundamental, it's the primary mandate of the European Central Bank. And that's the case with pretty much all central banks across the world. The second thing they said is that the central bank should not be looking at the long-term interest rates. We should be concerned with the short-term interest rates, which is again tied to that inflation mandate. And third, they argued that we need what we call as central bank independence. We need an independent central bank that is insulated from politics, because it is political mismanagement which essentially caused the stagflation. It is political mismanagement that we get into crisis. That was the idea that one time, and therefore the central bank needs to be independent from the law. So these three things essentially meant that the central bank would now operate only in an apolitical system. It would operate only using interest rates, and it would only operate through a regime of technocracy and managerialism. Okay. Now, as a result of that, okay, this is a bit of self-promotion. The article on the left, I document that, essentially how central banks were transformed from these institutions of development to these technocratic managerial institutions that served and was serving the interests of capital. But that's not the important article. The important article is here, the contested terrain approach to political economy of central banking. So Gerald Epstein writes a number of different papers where he says that money, number one, is not a neutral instrument. Right? There are class relations within money that we don't often see, but they exist. And he sort of argues that when a central bank, right, targets inflation, right, we need to be able to question the distributive impact of that with respect to different classes. Now, I want to ask you, what do you think happens when we target inflation? Who does it benefit? Who does it mean?
People with money to loan.
People who have, yeah, so people who have assets in something, because that's what is getting stabilized, right? But, you know, if you're going to target inflation, which means that you're going to pull out money from the economy, which means that there will be less production and more unemployment, then essentially the brunt of that inflation rate is going to be hit on the workers in some sense, right? So there is a class dimension that he brings out in this equation, right? There is also quite a bit of critique on quantitative easing that has come up. Do any of you know what that is? Quantitative easing?
No.
No. Okay. Sorry.
Money printing.
Money printing, exactly. Essentially, it is that. So quantitative easing is a tool through which central banks plug money into the market by buying bonds. They buy bonds, plug money into the market, and the idea is that that flooding of money into the market would again kickstart the economy. That's what central banks did after the financial crisis in 2008, where more and more central banks started getting into quantitative. And there has been quite a bit of protests around it because quantitative easing also has a class dimension. The more central bank money you pump into the economy, right, the higher the price of those assets go up. People who have asset shares, bonds, and so on and so forth, right? Because central bank is buying those bonds. It is creating a demand for bonds in the market. Now, I don't know how many of you own bonds, but I don't see many of you do. Right? Bonds are owned by financial institutions and banks. So it is these financial institutions and banks that ultimately, and people who run it, ultimately benefit out of that quantitative easing. Right? Although it is meant, and the idea was that quantitative easing is going to lift the entire economy and there are going to be more jobs and workers' welfare and so on and so forth, that did not happen. Right? Main beneficiaries were people, or the main beneficiaries were the property class, essentially. Property in the sense of people who have the capacity to hold assets in terms of bonds and shares and so on and so forth. So check this up when you get the time. So yes, so Epstein on the right, I mean, he calls that, he says that central banks and monetary policy must be able to look at it from a class perspective, and he calls it that is usefully viewed as a contested terrain between interests of finance, labor, industry, and the state. Right, and there is always a contestation and struggle between these different interests that are happening within money, and the central bank plays a key role in mediating that struggle. Right. Okay. Dollar hegemony. I think that's important to address. What do we mean by dollar hegemony, and how does it link with empire of today? Right. Now, when you think, so we know the Bretton Woods system, 1945, right? What happened in the Bretton Woods system from a finance and money perspective?
Central banks became independent.
No, actually, central banks became independent somewhere close to the 1980s, 1990s. That's where it happened, yeah.
Tied money to the value of the
Sorry.
commodity. It tied money to the value of a commodity being sold, right?
That's one part of the story, correct? Yeah.
It was connected to gold. Money, the value of money was connected to the value of gold.
Yes, that's again one part of the story. There is like, just like money, commodity, money, there is something in between. That gold and money.
Gold and money.
Between gold and money.
Oh,
The dollar, exactly. So what happened in Bretton Woods was that all the currencies in the world were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar in turn was pegged to gold. Right. So in some sense, the Bretton Woods system institutionalized the hegemony of the dollar. Right? Every currency had to be pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate, which is why sometimes it's also called the fixed exchange rate system, the Bretton Woods system. So a lot of scholarship a lot of mainstream scholarship has argued that the Bretton Woods system constituted this new public international law of money, where there was cooperation, there was solidarity, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, what it actually did was that it institutionalized dollar hegemony in a very big way. And it was further entrenched when the Bretton Woods system failed in 1971. Because in 1971, when Nixon announced, that's called the Nixon shock, when Nixon announced that the United States is no longer going to link its currency to gold, it's going to become untamed from gold, dollar debt effectively became the only standard. Right? Now, if dollar becomes the only standard, it means that the US dollars serve three core functions internationally. Your colleague spoke about it. Unit of account, measure of value, and a means of exchange. So what happened was that a national currency, the US dollar, became also the de facto international currency, because that was the only currency which would act at the international level as a unit of account, measure of value, and a medium of exchange. Right? What are the implications of that? There are several implications. We'll deal with a few of them. Let's take the first one. How do you think this is possible? You've heard of this, right? So when the Taliban came into power, one of the first things that Joe Biden did was freeze the central bank assets of Afghanistan Bank, which is a central bank. How is this possible? The United States is somewhere else, Afghanistan Bank sits somewhere else. How is this possible? How was it able to do it? What is the mechanism through which it's able to do it?
Refuses the convertibility of its currency into dollars.
Yes, but in a specific way. Yeah.
So Afghan assets would be US bonds.
Sorry?
Afghan assets would be partially US bonds.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's true. So central bank reserves, right, or central bank assets, because of the hegemony of dollar, is usually always denominated in US dollars. And how do you denominate an asset in US dollars? By buying US Treasury bonds, for example. And usually when central banks like Afghanistan and India and others, they buy US bonds as assets, they keep those assets within the United States itself, because that is likely going to provide the amount of flexibility, liquidity, as well as stability than in their own countries. Right? So in some sense, a good part of the central bank assets of Afghanistan was actually in the US. And that is the reason they were able to do it. Right? This is just to show you that that's the extent of which it goes, right? Now, these are some snippets that from newspapers, and I'm going to go a bit quickly from here. These are some snippets from newspapers which suggest the link, as your colleague pointed out, between the debt that exists in developing countries and how that debt is affected by decisions of the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank. Why? Because the debt that developing countries take are more often than not denominated in US dollars. And US dollars is the currency that the Federal Reserve manages. So if tomorrow the United States Federal Reserve says that we are going to raise interest rates of US dollar in our country, that will have tremendous effects across the world, because every other country is borrowing in US dollars. Are we able to see this? Yeah. So these are all newspaper reports in the last 2-3 years as to how the developing countries are really in a massive debt, and how monetary policy is affecting it. So this is a map essentially of to show you the fact that because US dollars is the reserve currency of the world, it is actually the US Federal Reserve, which is the central bank, that has become the lender of last resort in the world. Right? So whenever countries now, especially developing countries, face what is called a balance of payments crisis, which is nothing but a currency crisis, they have two options, or maybe three. First, they ask another friendly state to help them out. Second, they go to the IMF or a similar institution. They are not always willing to go to the IMF because the IMF comes with its own set of problems and stigma and conditionalities and so on and so forth. The third thing is, well, you go to the source, which is US Federal Reserve. Those are the ones printing US dollars, right? What we saw is that after the 2008 financial crisis, the United States Federal Reserve established all of these swap lines. These are all swap lines, right? Where it agreed to provide US dollars to those countries that were facing some kind of a liquidity problem. What we observed was that the US Federal Reserve was extremely selective about which countries they are going to swap with, right? Only these countries, the United States, agreed to do it. But in 2008 and following onwards, there were so many other countries that needed US dollars, but the US was not going to. And there's considerable amount of literature which shows that the US Federal Reserve not only had economic considerations, but also a large amount of geopolitical considerations in terms of whom it supports with its liquidity. So this is just to show you that this is where the source of tremendous authority and power lies, as opposed to the IMF today, right? Empire and dollar hedging. Yes.
No Germany?
No, because well, Germany at that point in time did not need because Germany has historically had a surplus in its budget.
Yeah.
So we come back to Joseph Koime. Now he did analyze this problem way before in the 1980s. And he gives us three problems to deal with when it comes to the international monetary system and the role of the US dollar. One is what we spoke about, that it is an anomaly that a national currency becomes an international currency. Not really an anomaly, actually, because that's exactly how it was also during the colonial era. It was the pound then, the British pound, which became the standard for every other colony. That has been replaced by the US dollar. And there is always this burden of adjustment on deficit countries who do not have that flexibility and liquidity. Settler colonialism and currency dependency, right? Now, with respect to the ongoing genocide in Gaza, we have discovered and talked about a lot of different things. Right? We've talked about the use of force. We've talked about international humanitarian law. We've talked about how measures might be disproportionate and so on and so forth. And there is a complete violation of the UN Charter, right? But what we haven't spoken as much about is how this infrastructure of military intervention is undergirded by deep relations of dependency and subordination of money. And one of the clearest examples of this, there are several others, and which is why I put that report out. You can have a look at it. And remember, this report is in 2009, not in 2023 and later, right? What is important to note is the fact that Palestine does not have its own currency. It uses Israeli shekel, right? And we know from our CFA franc example what that means. Every monetary decision is tied to the Israeli central bank. That kind of authority is tremendous authority. And this setup, among other things, taxes and other things that you can get into, but I won't right now, but it's there in the report. This was institutionalized through both the Oslo Accords, but also the Paris Protocol. Paris Protocol becomes very important because the Paris Protocol laid down the conditions of economic and monetary exchange that's going to happen between Palestine and Israel. Right. So read this report. An instance to tell you that currency relations have been at the core of settler colonial expansion. Okay, this is the last slide. Then we're done. What does it all tell us? A few things, I guess, that we cannot look at money without looking at relations of class, relations of race, and settler colonialism. Money form is important because under capitalist social relations, things like race, gender, money, all of these things, right, have a certain appearance and form. They represent certain things. They are things in themselves, but they also represent things, value. So the form of money, the form of labor matters. Money and finance are also important battlegrounds for decolonization. We can discuss that in the question and answers. I don't want to get into it right now. And a Marxist perspective is useful in the sense of it highlights the violence of money and the politics of financialization. Thank you very much. Great. Questions, comments? What did you like? What did you not like? This is useful for me as well. Oh, yes, please.
What is to be done? And I guess because we make, one of the main things of our 3 days has been how do we use the knowledge that we gather and the learning that we do in our organizing. And so how do we use this in our organizing? Can you perhaps give an example? How will we do that? I mean, it can just simply be like understanding this is of course a necessary prerequisite to like being able to understand the world, but that kind of in way it feeds into it, but are there any more concrete ones?
Yeah. Maybe can you connect a few and then yes.
Question or?
Can you also give me your name?
Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah, I'm Jenny. I wondered if you could follow up a bit on one of your earlier slides where you talked about NFT being incompatible with the Marxist framework. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, where you see the incompatibility.
Yeah.
It's a question of mine.
Yeah. But I saw that, yes.
So yeah, I'm following what Riba has talked about.
And you are?
My name is Peter.
Peter, yes.
So yeah, following on what Riba has asked.
Yeah.
So what is the place of structural adjustment programs by IMF, especially in global south countries? And especially I'm asking this in the context of Kenya, where so the last 1 year there have been so many protests against IMF because they came up with structural adjustment programs. So they didn't raise that. So what how do you see, or what would be your argument about structural adjustment programs in the context of this project about the question of currency, but yeah, so there's that also aspect of structural adjustment.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, online, yes.
Yeah, Clara?
Hi,
Hello.
my camera's on. Hey, I'm Laura. Thank you so much for the lecture. It was really, really interesting. And I was just thinking about in relation to Danai's presentation on Thursday, where we were talking about like the National Forum and the idea that like, okay, we need to like try and like overcome this like way we've been socialized into thinking of like the world divided up into nation states, because like capital doesn't operate according to that logic, like it's like a global system. But then also in your presentation we see that it actually does kind of operate very much on the basis of nation states as well. And it's like, I'm just wondering how you like conceptualize that. Do you see it as like almost like coalitions within like class factions that that organize around nation states? Yeah, I'm just like how, I guess it's probably just like dialectical or whatever, but how you kind of like deal with that contradiction.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So that was all very I think important information for us to take in and to think about. And I have more like a comment rather than question. So I did ethnographical work, and so I do look at anthropologist work, say Karen Poe's on liquidated, so ethnography of Wall Street, where she argues that indeed financialization and financial capital is the ultimate abstracted form of capital. But she argues that that abstraction, that financialization, is actually deeply cultured just by looking at how only a very specific group of people can get inside Wall Street, and that tells a lot already. And the reason why I raised this, probably a cultural and substantive underpinning of this abstraction, is that because, say, when we're talking about debt and how capital becomes sort of self-productive by minting on debt itself, we are criticizing it, but wouldn't that be also we are sort of helping to exchange what it is actually doing, i.e. fetishizing itself, because, for example, in 2008, the money does not really reproduce itself. It's people who lost their homes, who paid their rent but lost their home and paid for their mortgages, who sort of ultimately born that capital's self-productive product. So it was still a produced thing, is not a self-produced thing. So I think it's very important, at least from the academic research perspective, to try to find a way to acknowledge the substantive social productive side happening behind the abstracted process. So I just wonder, what would you say to that, and whether in your own research you have find a way to sort of give credit to the substantive, the social relations and pains caused by the capitalist abstraction.
So thank you from my side, Kanad. I wanted you just ask you a little bit about how do you see the role of the regulation of financial markets. I think you kind of hinted a bit on the role of the IMF, etc., that we don't have really regulation, or do we have a regulation? You see the international financial law there. Something emerging or something that could be tactically fought for in this moment.
Yeah. Okay. It's fine.
Sorry, I don't have time, but if you could, more like, how do you see as a Marxist, and how do you think that us as Marxists should see the possibility of the emergence of a BRICS currency and what it represents to the dollar?
Yep. Okay, great. We can start with this. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'm going to take the easier ones first. And then work myself up to the difficult. Yeah. Okay, so MMT and Marxist framework. So yes, there are a few differences. Now, first thing is with respect to how, with respect to the origins of money. Marxist, it's spontaneous, it's commodity exchange, and that's how it emerges. And then at some point, the state intervenes to take that. For MMTs, money has always been a feature of the state. So what they are, so basically they argue, drawing from chartalist and neo-chartalist theory, saying that money has always been state-backed. and therefore has a public dimension to it. That's one. The second thing is that MMT argues that the value of money can be determined and changed by the state, right? Because the state has control over its own currency, it can essentially print as much as it wants, thereby affecting the value of money within the economy, right? Marxists would argue that no, that is not possible. You cannot assign an arbitrary value to money. Money is nothing but a representation because it's a form of appearance, it's not a thing. It's a representation of all the goods and services that are there in the economy. It cannot be more or less. That's second. And third, I think, is the question of inflation. So MMTs argue that, well, if you continuously print money, you know, they argue against the fact that if you continuously print money, you will run into an inflation problem. They say that you will not run into an inflation problem because at the same time you will have other supporting structures. So, for example, a job guarantee scheme, I don't know, a public, fully financed public welfare scheme, and so on and so forth. So, all of that money that goes out of the economy will somehow be sucked into these entities. Marxists would argue, I think, that since the value of money is sort of tied to commodities, and commodities are tied to the productive capacity of a particular state or nation, increasing productive capacity, so setting up more factories, setting up, I don't know, more whatever is going, that takes time. So it cannot immediately respond to that extra amount of money that flows in. So these are some of the main things I find which are different. There's a good paper by Nicholas and Lavavistas. I can send you that. It's called A Marxist Critique of MMT. And that's a good thing to start off with. I see over there. Okay.
We'll have to ask for discussion.
Okay.
We'll let you know when the time is.
Okay. So I think I don't have to right now answer her question. Okay. So Peter, what is the place of structural adjustment programs in Kenya, right? And how do you see structural adjustment programs? So structural adjustment programs have always been a means of subordination and dependence. I think there is no question about that. And interestingly, in the 1980s and 90s, when structural adjustment programs were starting to be heavily criticized because of the kind of impact it was having, not just the impact it was having, but also economists started pointing out that the rationality itself, the economic rationality itself is flawed, then you saw a slight shift in the IMF. What the IMF started doing was, it was moving away from conditional financing, which is part of structural adjustment programs, to something called surveillance, monetary surveillance, which is not so much about money, but giving money, but it's about assessing economies, ranking economies, standardizing monetary policy frameworks, and so on and so forth. Right? So it moved away from this coercive structural adjustment programs to more softer ideological frameworks. So the interesting thing about Kenya is that structural adjustment programs, I think, came back in a big way. So it came back in a big way in Kenya, but also came back with in Sri Lanka. I think both of these places really had this instrument, and I think a part of it has to do also with how the IMF sort of interacts with the elite ruling class in Kenya. There is quite a bit of There's quite a bit of interplay that happens between them. And that's dimension of class that also needs to be taken into account, right? So domination and subjugation through international institutions would hardly be possible if, let's say, it would not be both infrastructurally but also ideologically supported by the ruling elites of that time. Right? Yeah, I think that's all I can say about that. So Laura, capitalism and the nation state, yes, I think that's a very interesting question and a difficult one. What is the role? So yes, I mean, there is a contradiction in some sense, no? Because capitalism is global, but nation states have their own borders and own space, right, within which they work. But the thing is that, you know, what is interesting about Marxist conception of money and also about Hilperding and in particular, is that they never really saw the global and the local as two different things. They were never disconnected in that sense, right? For them, money necessarily, because of capitalist production, necessarily has to be world money. There is no other way out. And in that set of circumstances, I think the state plays a big role. And it plays a big role, like, and this is to quote another Marxist scholar, Umut, I don't know if you've read his work or you should read his work. He calls the state as the crystallization of class struggle, right? Basically meaning that the state plays this contradictory role where it subsumes different factions within the society, but also sort of depoliticizes class struggle at the same time. And the way I see it is that the state then becomes this perfect neutral form through which then capital transcends borders in some sense. More than that, I can't really say. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Then we have, sorry, I didn't get your name.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I forgot to say that. I'm not there.
Lovely. Very nice to meet you, Lovely. So financialization, yes. And you're right. I think behind the layer of financialization, there is this much deeper layer of social cost and social relations and materiality of people losing homes. Absolutely, there's no doubt about that. And so I think from any Marxist perspective, any Marxist perspective has to sort of recognize this aspect of social relations. I mean, it cannot work otherwise, right? And to be honest with you, at least the ones who work on financialization, I have seen that this social totality that we talk about under Marxism includes both an aspect of the pains and the value in some sense. And pain and value are not different things, but sort of reinforce each other. Yeah, so absolutely no. I mean, I don't think there would. Yeah, I don't think these two things can operate differently. So regulation of financial markets, right? What is the role of the law? Is there a tactical way in which one can use financial law? Well, I think yes, it is possible. It is possible to do it. It depends a bit on. So it depends a bit on who is doing it. So if, let's say, and depends a bit on where you're doing it. So where are the nodes of regulatory authority in finance? That's the first question. So who are the ones really who are making the rules here, right? And if you really look at it, I mean, we tend to think that international financial markets regulation would be things like the IMF and the World Bank and so on and so forth. And that's true, right? But underpinning those institutions are essentially private investors and private banks, right? They are really at the core of what financial regulation needs to regulate. And that is where the problem really starts coming in, right? Because financial institutions and financial markets do not always have a public forum, and do not always come with claims of legitimacy and accountability that institutions like the IMF and the World Bank are being subject. Okay, so that is where I think the problem is, that how do you deal with questions of private finance rather than public finance? The public finance is easier to deal with. It's visible, it's right there, structural adjustment programs, people know. But for instance, how derivative markets, for example, operate, and the players within the derivative markets, which are banks and financial institutions, what do you do about that? I think that's really the question. Marxism and the BRICS currency, right? That's an interesting question, no? Because there's a lot of talk now about South monetary coordination, right? So a lot of these new institutions are being created, including the BRICS Bank. Then you have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. You have a few others that have now come up. And yeah, the commitment is that we move away from dollar hegemony by creating our own currency. I think it's difficult to do, but it doesn't change the nature of analysis that we have, because so if you really go from a Marxist perspective, the problem is money. The problem is not. I mean, the question of hegemony, empire, and imperialism is a problem, whether that be from the BRICS or whether that be from the US, matters less. What matters more is what kind of value does money represent within the capitalist system. So if your radicality has to go to the extent of being actually radical and Marxist, then arguably what you ought to be fighting against is the value form and the money form in Marx systems. That is the struggle. Yeah. Now the first question, maybe what do we do about organizing? Maybe actually when the river is back, we can talk about it. Yeah. So that's your question. Yes.
Yes. Do we have time for a question? Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks a lot. So I was thinking, like in terms of with previous question also, I really think that through financial regulation also, or international economic instruments, I think there are ways to organize and support democratic ways of finance, really in local level, especially at community level, and international economic instruments can really be utilized, I think that. So, but that's something I want to explore in my research as well. But in terms of financialization, this question I think was really important, because some scholars claim that actually there is no such thing as financialization, but actually what we call financialization is actually just a process of commodification, right? So I was wondering what you think about that, because I'm very scared. I mean, in my research, financialization plays a big role in the literature, at least in the discussion. Yeah. But also the way I see it is indeed, I mean, of course, Epstein and others speak of financialization as outcome of how things are measured, how things are all integrated into financial decision-making processes, while actually even money to money, like self-producing money, actually is backed by productive real economic activities in society, right? So indeed, as well, I was saying that his money doesn't come out of nowhere. It is backed by productive activities in society. So actually some others are paying that money to for capital to accumulate from money itself. So in that way, I think still for that you need the commodity in between actually. So money, I mean, in a bond relationship, money produces money, but bond is actually, as Lapavitsas says, it's a commodity. It's the crystallization of legal right, actually, right? Legal right to property. So in that way, what do you think of that? Actually, like that, that idea of that challenges financialization.
Yeah, so no, I think it can go together because what you said is correct. I mean, financialization is the higher is a form of commodity. There is no other way to look at it. And yeah, the MCM and MM formula are simply analytical frameworks, and you don't have to go by that. But you're right. I mean, the MCMs can also work with M commodity being a bond. In fact, commodity being yourself, depending on whether it's, I don't know, social media, where you're basically the commodity and you're transferring the data and so on and so forth. It can be that, absolutely, yeah. So in the end, that is what. So in the end, it doesn't matter because whether it's MCM or whether it's MM, it is undergirded by real processes, social processes. Number one, and second, in both these processes, ultimately there is a tremendous amount of surplus value generated on the back of others, and that never really is distributed. That's the problem. Yes.
I just want to piggyback on lots of things that you have just said.
Yeah.
So when you said that the state itself becomes a more neutral form in the process of financialization, that prompts me to think, is there something fundamentally private about financialization? Because it seems like things are getting more and more private, even the state being neutral, vis-a-vis being more public, it seems to be going towards the direction of privatization. And if that is the conclusion or sort of observation I can draw, then when comes that the sort of private form, and then I cannot help but think about the Federal Reserve itself. Instead of a state organ, is fundamentally more like a company in itself, being as a collective of sort of different state banks and coming together, becoming a corporation, and even have a board. And then for all the area development banks, and I'm also curious to hear your view on this, say for example, Asian Development Bank. It started as a bit more autonomous thing among the Asian countries, but then we see in the recent years how the United States, Japan, and some other major stakeholders to drive ADB to do more private loans and get more privatized. And then in the whole financialization process, we seem to see the private powers like the banks and the more technocrat organizations and elites, these things that we do not know that well about their forces, about their violence vis-a-vis national states, taking the main stage. So I wonder, do you find any fundamentally private or a deep connection between the supremacy of private property rights with financialization? I don't, I'm not sure whether I make sense, but.
No, so I got a few points from your. So I mean, first things first, I think financialization would be impossible without the institutional property. I think that's fundamental. There is no doubt about it. The second thing is, if I got it correctly, I mean, this blurring line between public and the private in some sense. And to be honest with you, this line has always been blurred. It is not a recent, right? So, for example, if you go back to the colonial times, the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, they were private, but they were also public, right? So I think this public-private divide is not a new thing. It's a continuing feature of how capitalism works, right? Which is why the more important thing is the form through which it operates. But after Marx looks at the form, what is the form, the company form, for example, right? The money form, for example. So the form through which it operates rather than whether something is public or private. I think that would be, and not necessarily, and I think that insight that this public-private divide has always been blurred also sort of helps us understand that, more public does not necessarily mean more good, and vice versa, right? As long as the real question would be, I think, number one, mode of production. So who owns the mode of production in a community? That's the main thing. And how that ownership is sort of distributed is the real question. Whatever kind of society. Yes.
If you'd like.
I just have one last question. Because then, like, the problem is money, and that takes me to think about commons.
Commons.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I would like to understand your take on commons in this sense, because that's the problem. Like, we cannot reproduce it in a large scale. The case that works really minor, really specific. But then we are talking here, the problem is money, and then where we're going all like because I think it's the only example that we have or at least not the only example, but the closest, and then we talk about, and there's like polarization and
Yeah, I'm not too sure if we really have commons, whether we've ever had them in some sense, because I mean, because I think commons is somewhat of a misnomer because it suggests that everybody has an equal claim to it, which is not the case, which has never been the case. Yes, I'm not. I don't idolize commons in that sense. I think for me, from a historical materials perspective, I think nothing really has been in the common. There have always been expropriators, and there have always been expropriated.
So then there's the commons and also more like insert in the scheme of things like there.
Yeah, I mean, commons is also sort of a way, like the movement of commons, you can trace it. I mean, it's also sort of a way to sort of deflect historical responsibility in some sense, and not look at past practices of colonialism, but from the understanding that, okay, now we have a limited set of commons which has been damaged, and so on and so forth. What do we do from now on itself? So regulation of the commons and so on and so forth. I'm not a big fan of the
No, but it's interesting because I think there are a lot of people that work with commons and stuff, and hopefully I'm thinking good.
Minus other point, it's kind of referring to the MMT question.
Yeah.
And hopefully onto some other things, but it feels like in a way like Marxism is also kind of a theory of NMT as something that emerges at a certain point in time. Because NMT is kind of like, the state could do X, Y, or Z if it wanted to, and then Marxism is in a way an attempt to think the state, as you say, is this kind of like crystallization of social forces. It's a kind of like outward and in-facing version of a kind of trade union consciousness in this sense, which is also the source of its kind of political limitations. And Marxism attempts to be like, why does the state do the things that it does do? And that in a way changes the kind of, but the state gains this kind of positivist capacity to literally like make stuff the case at a certain point in time, will intervene in this way that's recognized by MMT. And that potentially kind of like shifts the terrain of political struggle a little bit away from what we might think of as a more kind of like empirical commodity production type situation, which is kind of what we're pointing to here in a way what River's question is about. The distinction between like financialization and commodification, where in a sort of traditional framework of commodification, you can point to the labor process as somewhere you can kind of like put a stop to stuff and kind of arrest the cycle of accumulation. But then the question in a way is like, where does the, there's an observation about MMT as like a certain historical thing, and then also maybe something that like shifts the terrain of political struggle to something that's much more difficult to fathom, which is like, how do you deal with things that level of abstraction? And maybe it is just a case of like demystifying the fetish form and kind of finding out at the point where that value is in a sense produced and then intervening. That very like, sorry, I'm being very abstract, but it's like
No.
Yeah, does that make sense? Where it's like, it's difficult to fathom how you would like struggle politically against the sort of force that is represented historically by MMT and all the possibilities that forwards, which does kind of like attend this conjuncture that you get in Hilberding and the current where you have emergence of monopoly forms of capital and financialization. And it just becomes very difficult to work out how you would like
intervene. Yeah, no, I agree. So which is why MMT has sort of gained this popularity in some sense, especially within the left. So Bernie Sanders is a big supporter of MMT, for example. AOC is a big supporter of MMT, for example. And it does, I mean, it does, I think, provide some kind of an analytical framework for progressive politics. I mean, I'm not denying that. But you know, my only problem is that so MMTs themselves do not consider themselves to be a theory. So they don't consider MMT to be a theory. They consider MMT to be a lens, like a description of how finance actually works. Right? The problem is that a lot of the claims in which MMT bases itself in terms of how finance works and has worked is probably not historically correct, right? And that is where my problem is. Right? I mean, to be honest, if tactically we want to use MMT to pressure governments to sort of spend on healthcare, spend on a universal job guarantee scheme, and so on and so forth, I am all for it, right? But we cannot lose the fact that that in the long term, at the end of the day, the way we construct value within society and within social relationships is nonetheless going to be the metrics of money, right? Anyway, that's the largest strategy battle. What do you do and how do you do it? I guess. Yeah, it definitely has a certain purchase energy, right? And I'm really not questioning its progressive potential. I mean, I would take out whatever works really. But
it's just the kind of voluntarism in a way where it's like, oh, why doesn't the state do this? Like, obviously, the state doesn't do that for certain reasons that are the source of its necessity. That's like it's subject to certain forces that are beyond its control, or it's like mediating those forces by locating what it is. Rather than being like, you can print money, why don't you print money?
Yeah, no, but I mean, it goes against capitalist interests because I mean, if the idea is that you print more money, as the MMT suggests, and as a structural adjustment, you also make a universal job guarantee scheme, that does not go in the interest of capitalists because, well, then the bargaining power of the workers increase, their unionization will increase, they have to raise wages and so on. It's not good for the capitalists. I mean, they wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah, just something. You talked about MMT being supported by people like AOC and Bernie Sanders in the US.
Yeah.
In the UK, would it be fair to say that the sort of Rachel Reeves version of economic policy is simply a monetarism? She doesn't move dollar or help. Whereas AOC and Sanders and the left wing, the Democrats in the US, have at least some kind of attempted alternative to neoliberal economics, monetarism. Whereas Reeves seems to just be a creature of the Bank of England. Or is that too simplistic?
I would have no. I mean, I don't know much to be honest. You'll have to tell me a bit more about the policy, and then maybe I can comment on it. I haven't followed up as much on the basis, to be honest.
Maybe.
Sorry.
Maybe I think it's more Rachel Reeves. So he's the treasurer of the UK, but it's quite a conservative line that she has, which is basically, she uses the household analogy of spending, tax and spend, etc. So
right, so that doesn't work. No.
So exactly. So we can't spend on housing because it will mean increased taxes or this and that. Of course, there are exceptions. Wars and things like that. But that's the traditional, which is of course the what MMT
Critiques,
specifically
yeah,
critiquing.
correct,
in-
correct.
As I said, politically, I think in mainstream circles, it's
Yeah.
quite powerful to
Yeah,
actually
it is.
break through that, because
Yeah,
that
yeah.
has been the stranglehold of,
Yes.
saying that we can't spend on this because your taxes will go up.
Correct, correct. No, in that sense, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a position that really, in any case, is unsustainable. I mean, that's not possible. I mean, that's wrong. The household analogy, absolutely. And again, the crucial question would be that, whether you pick up MMT as a counter to this problem, or do you pick up, the Marxist question of deep structural change within the economy, and to what form do you want to see money going forward? I think that's the question. MMT is a good starting point in terms of a tactic. I mean, I'm not really against it, but it really shows its sort of weaker points when you start analyzing it from a historical perspective. That it's really not the story that it has claimed it to be. Yeah.
So, few announcements. So first, thank you, Kanad.
Thank you.
Lunch is in same spot as yesterday.